Hey everyone, good evening. Also, good evening, Peter. Thanks for joining us. Um, so, welcome to another community event hosted by Software Thoughts Person of India. So, we are uh, we are a community of software thoughts people based out of the entire country, and we are a totally voluntary organization, and we host these community events. And today we have with us here Peter Thomas, and uh, our company Incubate is one of the sponsors for this community. And today we will be discussing about karate and full stack API testing. And with us today here is Peter, who will be speaking on that. Introducing Peter, he is recognized as one of the world's topmost expert in test automation, and he has with him 25 years of industry experience. And of those, 18 years has been in open source. He has worked at Yahoo and Intuit and has been part of the API platform leadership at Intuit. He is also the creator of Karate, the open source solution for unifying API, UI, and performance testing. And he was selected as one of the 15 people for the GitHub Karate in 2021. And he's also one of the few maintainers chosen to be featured on GitHub India.com. He co-founded Karate Labs in 2021 to accelerate the adoption of karate with the mission of making test automation fun and collaborative. And Karate Labs is a Y Combinator backed company. So, without further ado, Peter, I give the platform to you.
All right. Yeah, thanks. And good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here and thank you for inviting me to talk. As you have heard, my profile is very focused on my experiences a lot in test automation. So today I'm going to talk about karate and I'll also do some demos. I'm not sure. Normally, if I'm in a room, I'll do like a check, how many people know and have used karate. But I'll give you some evidence of karate being quite popular. It's being used by a lot of big logos all across the world, and I will give you some evidence of that. So you can sit back, and of course, I think in terms of logistics, I'm happy to actually take questions during the session. We will have plenty of time for Q&A, so my slides are not too many. I think I'll be able to wrap up in actually 40 minutes, and then if we have interest in questions, we can go from there. So with that, let me kick this off. I will have a few slides as an intro, and then I will get into a few demos as well. Okay, so there we go. And yeah, I'll start with some of these challenges and the stuff that I'm very passionate about, of course, which is I see a lot of problems in the world of software development, delivery, production, support, observability, and so on, DevOps. And I see many teams actually make this mistake of trying to create a test automation framework from scratch. There's a lot of LinkedIn posts and a lot of noise on social media about that. Maybe you've seen it also in some of your teams. I strongly discourage that, and I'll give you a sense of why. But spoiler alert, right? It's very, very hard. I have been actually trying to make a framework as open source for the last 6 to 7 years, and we're still not done in some ways. Of course, people are focused on building their resume and skills. So that's another reason why I see a lot of teams kind of make this mistake of let's write a framework instead of actually focus on what you need to be doing for your end user or customer. I'm today, of course, going to focus a lot on API test automation, but I'm sure all of you have heard of big names like Selenium, Cypress, Playwright. These tools have been around for a long time, and also people tend to think of when you think of end-to-end functional testing, people for some reason they assume it's going to be UI automation. And I'm here to kind of hopefully change your thinking a little bit and give you a sense there are better ways to do test automation, and APIs are one of the best ways to actually access and test your full stack, almost your full stack of your architecture in some way. no code. There's so many tools out there already mentioned, Selenium, Cypress. Even for API testing, you have Postman, you have Insomnia, you have Catalan. So how do you choose? That's one of the biggest challenges in a team. Here I am, of course, going to give you some data points on Karate, and of course, along while I'm talking and doing demos, one of the things I'd like you to think about is compare it with whatever tools you are familiar with and see the differences. I think some of you have heard shift left. I know there are teams that are taking the extreme step of, we don't need any QA, all developers own testing at the same time. I have opinions on that. But we all know today we live in a world where, we hear of companies like Facebook release multiple times per day. And that pressure to keep up with the competition adds to a lot of stress if you are in any modern development team. And the last 2 points on the slide are a big debate that keeps happening, right? As I said, there are teams that shift left and in the process, focus only on developers and say we don't need folks who can't code. But I feel sometimes, the folks that actually understand the customer and spend time knowing the business should be in charge of writing end-to-end tests and functional tests. And I think that's a good mix to have on a team. So, we've been hearing about Karate, and I know you heard the intro, but again, a reminder, Karate is an is a test automation framework. It is open source. You can find it on GitHub, and I think it's worth mentioning that Karate is one of the few Indian open source projects to actually, be successful. We have around 7,500 stars today. Of course, one of the things I would love for all of you to do later after the session is to, if you like Karate, add a star to GitHub. It really helps in terms of our visibility and so on. I won't read out all the advantages, but while I go through the demos, I'll try to call out some of these advantages. And these are very important. I feel a lot of test automation tools, under perform on some of these attributes. So it's something for you to think about. Yes, is Karate successful, popular, being used? Here, I leave it to you to look at these logos. There are a lot of companies, big names all across the world. And I personally, along with my co-founder, over the last 2 years, after we incorporated Karate Labs, we have actually talked to almost all these companies. And that's one of the exciting things about doing an open source project that is popular, of course, where you really have a sense of the impact that your code is creating in enterprise teams all across the world. One of the reasons why Karate is, of course, very popular is that it's not just a test automation framework. It integrates well into all the typical pieces that you expect in your enterprise, in your DevOps, CI/CD pipelines, and so on. And one of the things I would like you to look out for, and again, one of the themes of this talk is full stack, right? Karate, you might think, okay, it's API testing, but I'm pointing out to Kafka and gRPC and WebSocket. These are also things that Karate can test. In fact, we are launching, dedicated Kafka support, in fact, in the next 2 days. So watch out for that announcement. And as you would see, we have IDE plugins that really make it easier for developers to work on test automation. So how did this all start? Before getting into demos and more, what do you say, a deep dive into maybe the code. I know a lot of you are probably waiting to see code and less of talk. So I'll try to do demos. But where did this all start? At the bottom left, API testing was the first version of Karate when it was released in 2017. So at that point in time, I was working at Intuit, in Intuit Bangalore. And the reason I created Karate was because I looked at the API tests that my team was creating, and I didn't like it at all. I'm very opinionated, and I decided to try to create an alternative. And the first version of Karate was released in February 2017. It kind of blew up a little bit in a good way. I have personally done a lot of open source in the past. Some of you, I don't know whether some of you have even heard of SourceForge. That was the thing that was there before GitHub even existed. So I started there, had a few hits and misses, but karate really took off in 2017 because I think it filled a need. A lot of companies started using it, and the result of all that feedback and me getting motivated at this as this contributor to an open source project is we started adding all these things like API doubles is equivalent to API mocking. Um, Karate also does web browser automation. In case there's time and you're interested, I can do a quick demo of that. So if you're wondering, does Karate compete with Selenium, Cypress, and Playwright? It does, which is actually a huge deal in my opinion. One of the demos I'm going to do today is performance testing. So watch out for that. You can actually take an API test and reuse it as a performance test without having to rewrite it in another tool, which is actually a reason a lot of enterprises choose Karate. It saves you a lot of time and it's just neat. And you can actually do continuous performance testing in your CI/CD pipeline and so on. We also do desktop automation, which means if you have Windows applications, Karate can actually test that. Not many teams using that, to be honest. So before I move on to doing demos and getting deep into Karate and what it looks like, I'll just show you also what's Karate Labs. Now, what happened, you know that I was at Intuit, and what happened was you may have heard in my introduction, GitHub India actually recognized me in 2021 September as one of the few Indian open source projects, someone who's working on an Indian open source project who deserves recognition. So that kind of actually got me thinking, what, open source is much more fun than my day job. And I decided to actually create a company, co-founded it with a close friend of mine who's based in London called Kapil. And we are both, running Karate Labs, have been for the last 2 years. And our strategy to actually monetize open source is, via IDE plugins. You can use them. They are optional, but when you use these IDE plugins, you get a much superior development experience. Like you can actually debug tests, for example. We do have other products like a pure play API documentation solution, which is quite interesting. And as I said, Kafka and gRPC and WebSocket support. We're starting with Kafka this week. It's a new launch that you can look out for from Karate Labs. And at the end, and again, this is probably very important for me to call out. You might know that there's a lot of interest in moving away from Postman and Insomnia and solutions like that. So if you have Postman collection, for example, one of our plugin features is that you can actually import a Postman collection, convert it in seconds to a Karate test, and just move on. Okay, so a little bit of context, and one of the themes of this session is me trying to kind of brainwash all of you, saying, if you have a lot of UI tests, maybe a lot of them should be API tests. And API tests have a lot of advantages, that they are just simple. They just run, without a need for a UI. You can run them in parallel. And this picture kind of gives you a sense of the difference between, UI on the left, right? Let me talk about the picture on the left for a minute. That green blob that you see is JavaScript. And think of all the single page applications you work on probably in your day jobs, which is Angular, React, Vue, whatever. I know there's a whole bunch of there. And how do all these applications work? And if you think about all the internet experiences that you deal with, whether it's Gmail, Netflix, a shopping cart on Amazon, um, it's single page application, right? You load this big blob of JavaScript, and then that JavaScript makes get and post requests and gets JSON back, and that JSON has to get massaged into HTML in the DOM, and then you see your page update. That's how all applications work. So where does API testing fit in, right? So API testing kind of bypasses that whole complexity of the front end, and you directly make these calls, and then you get the data back, and then you validate that data. And if you think about this is how machines talk to other machines. So there's a lot more reasons, and I have a slide towards the end that you can actually screenshot and use as a reference, where I give you a very clear, comprehensive comparison between UI automation and API automation. And I would just prefer API automation. I have done my fair share of UI automation. It's really hard. In fact, I have a somewhat controversial point of view that UI writing UI tests can be actually harder than writing the UI because you have to take care of all those, async operation, DOM not loading, DOM loading after a delay, and it's really hard. And then you have to scrape elements out using CSS locators. And yeah, I have a lot of PTSD from writing UI automation. And after I discovered the world of API test automation and JSON is such a wonderful data format, and I can go on singing the praises of JSON actually after having worked with it deeply over the last 6 or 7 years. So I'll pause for a moment, allow you to digest this snippet of code. And yes, this is a hello world. I'm going to explain why karate is designed the way it is and what it looks like. And I think one of the things you will have noticed straight away is that karate doesn't look like any programming language they are used to. It's not Java, it's not C# or .NET, it's not JavaScript, it's not Python, it's not Ruby. It's this weird, syntax. And some of you may have, encountered Cucumber in the past, so you would immediately notice given, when, then, the first word on the left. Uh, that said, I do have to call out at this point that karate actually is not a BDD or a behavior-driven development framework. That is a common source of confusion, which is why I'm taking great pains to make clear that karate should be looked at as like a scripting language. Karate is almost like a programming language in itself. But as I'm going to talk through the slide, it's very deliberately designed in some ways, and it is very simple. Right? You can probably, I'm sure all of you figured out what this test does, and that's the whole beauty of karate. And so let me go deep. Number one, JSON is native. If you notice, I'm going to pause here and just ask the moderator to make sure I'm audible, everything is clear, and keep going. So
Yep.
all good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's worrying sometimes to do this session without any feedback. So I was saying JSON is native to the syntax. You can see curly braces, just type key colon value. JSON is great. I simply love JSON a lot actually. And in fact, you can see karate supports lenient JSON. You don't need quotes around the key property, the key value, and single quotes are sufficient. So this is exactly how JavaScript developers live and breathe JSON on a daily basis. So it's kind of elegant, less typing, just fits straight into karate. And we call karate a domain-specific language. And I've already given you, a sense and talked about why karate is so easy to read and maintainable, and people really like it after working with it for a short duration. But let me call your attention to the second word on each line: URL, request, method, status, and path. And URL, request, method, the moment you hear these things, right, you know what it means in the context of HTTP or REST, you know. So that's why karate, the language is very, very carefully designed to be simple, yet very expressive for what you're doing. Because remember, what is karate trying to do for you as an API test automation tool? It's actually two things. You want to um, make HTTP requests, okay, and you need to do validation of API responses, typically JSON, and that's what I'm showing you on this line. The match keyword in karate is probably one of the biggest capabilities it has. And let me explain this another way, right? In any language today, it's very, very easy to make an API call. You just need 2 lines of code, any language, right? You just need the URL, and then you say get post, the method, whatever it is, and you've made an API request. But when you're doing test automation, the hard part of all this is of your job is to validate all the data that comes back from what you call it. And right, in real life, these JSON responses can be humongously complicated. You'll have arrays, objects, nested objects, and it can get really hard to validate. And you can see karate has a few tricks here. Number one, you can see where you have these unpredictable values like this hash not null. We're basically saying we need an ID key, but we don't care about the value because we can't predict it, right? And you can also do schema validations. That's a separate, just the assertions part of karate is a fair amount of documentation, which you can go and read up. But this is a hello world example, but even for very complex JSONs, it just takes you one step in karate to do the validation. And I repeat, this is actually the most important thing you should expect from any test automation framework. Last but not the least, this example actually makes two calls. And you can see how you don't need to repeat the URL. You're just working with the path here. And most importantly, karate is really good at chaining data from the previous response into the next request. We are actually using this ID that came back in the previous response. Of course, the response is like a magic variable. It's automatically populated the moment you make a request. But you can actually use that variable, if you want to call it that way, just access properties of it by saying dot, dot, dot this, and you're off. So with that, I can actually do a demo. I know you all been listening to my voice for some time, so let me show you what an API test looks like. Okay. By the way, we are looking at Visual Studio Code. So karate has a official plugin. It's been downloaded 10,000 times already. It's pretty new, so it's pretty good progress. So let me go back to this test. This test is very similar to the Hello World example that I was showing you earlier. And I'm sure a lot of you know Visual Studio Code. We have a code lens called run. So if I click run, it will make these requests to the internet. In this case, this URL is a public URL. It's a very commonly used test service and so all that. And you can see the very nice logs in karate. But one of the biggest capabilities and differentiators of karate is this HTML report. You get a very nice HTML report when you run any karate test. And when you look at the report, you actually see the HTTP traffic inline. And this is super useful because obviously you can figure out what went wrong and all that. And in fact, what I'm going to do now as part of this demo is to just simulate an assertion failure. Okay. And when I rerun this test, this is the true test of a good test automation framework, right? When you have problems, and you will invariably have these builds of yours which are going to run red in CI/CD. So when something goes wrong, how easy is it for you to actually land at the error? Now, you do get a reasonable amount of information on the log, but if I just go back to that HTML report, reload it, you can see which line failed, and exactly, no matter how complex the JSON was, you will know exactly which nested field, which array element, which path actually failed. So karate is really good at telling you what went wrong, and of course karate is good at checking whether everything was okay, which is what you saw on this line as part of a match statement. Okay, so let's get on to a slightly more complicated demo. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to introduce performance testing in karate. I'm going to jump straight to that. And what I'm going to do is on the left, I have two consoles up. On the left, I'm going to boot an application. So this is our test application. It actually has a user interface, which I'm going to bring up. I'm sure some of you have seen this kind of a JavaScript application. It's a very simple application where you can add items into a to-do list and you can delete them. So you have all these operations via the UI, but all the operations also have a corresponding API. So there's a backend way to actually add to-dos. And I have actually a test written here, to actually add to-dos into localhost 8080. So I'm going to run this. By the way, this test that I'm scrolling through, and you will see the HTML report in a minute. This test is what I consider a really good API test. A lot of tools out there focus on just making one API call. Chaining is now a huge headache. You need to connect JavaScript from one UI tab to another. But if you look at this test, and let me run this, It's going to run against localhost. And if I look at the report, see how nice the report is. This is another one of the reasons, again, I created Karate was because when I looked at the API tests, I was having to deal with, or my team was having to deal with, um, I couldn't understand what the test was doing from a domain or a business point of view. And here you see, because you're encouraged to write comments, very few comments, but because there are some very strategically thoughtful comments in your test, along with the HTTP data, which is there, you also see what is this test doing from a end user point of view. So I hope that all of you get the sense as to why Karate is very popular. It's readable. This report is, of course, very useful from an HTML point of view. And these are super readable. So let's see what happens to our UI. If I reload, you can see as a consequence of this test, there are 2 records added into our kind of a dummy database via the API. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is taking that exact same test that we looked at, right, which is this simple dot feature, and we're going to now reuse that test as a performance test. So Karate, I don't know whether some of you may have heard of a tool called Gatling. It's another open source project, very popular for performance testing. It runs on the JVM, and by default, you have to write tests in Scala. Okay, but there's a little trick that we do here. When you use Karate, you need to do only 2 things. One, you point to an existing API test that you have already written in Karate. And the other thing that you need to do is you say how many users you want to multiply that one test by. Okay. And I'm actually going to run that. And you're going to see it on the right-hand side. And when the test runs on the left console, you should be able to see all that action and load hitting the server. There it is. And this test runs pretty fast. If I refresh the UI, you can see that, okay, some 20 more items got added actually, because we multiplied our existing test, 10 times. And finally, let me show you the Gatling report. So remember, right, the only thing you needed to add to your test was this one file. And by the way, you can really go deep. You can actually combine multiple features. For example, if you wanted to do a sophisticated load model that 50% of your users are doing read-only operations and the rest are doing updates, all that is possible. Here we're sticking to a very simple example. And now I'm going to paste the URL of the Gatling or the performance test report into the URL. And there it is. Gatling, again, wonderful tool. It tells you all the things that you typically look for, which is transactions per second, how many, what was your P99 and so on. So to recap, right, what did I just do here? I was showing you that in the old days, right, if you didn't have Karate, you would be pretty much having a second team coming in as specialists to do performance tests. And it's a huge waste because if you have written functional tests, you can't reuse them. Whereas with Karate, what you can do is like you just write once your functional tests, and then you just put that multiplication factor that you saw, and you get performance testing for free, which is pretty awesome. And that's the demo that I showed you right now. Cool. So we are at the halfway mark. I'm done with most of the demos, but in case you're interested, you can ask for UI testing demos and debugging demos, which is quite interesting. So one of the things I want to leave with all of you, right? Because I consider you all, my ambassadors now of the world of test automation. I'm sure all of you are working with companies or already dealing with test automation challenges, but uh, here we have a way of evaluating or what do you say, how do you compare test automation tools? There's a lot out there. There's a huge amount of test tool fragmentation, and I know I've seen teams waste maybe months of time just arguing as to which framework to choose, right? And people have different opinions. Some people want to choose framework A because it uses Python, because Python's your favorite language, and so on. We developers are very fussy people, right? We hate other languages and so on, which is bad. You should all look at other languages. But let me start this next slide with the picture on which has just been built on the screen on the bottom left. It's the test pyramid that some of you have heard of. You should have more unit tests and so on. But I'm using the concept of a test pyramid to actually break it down and say, what, there's a lot of other, what do you say, testing is complex nowadays, right? It's not just HTTP testing. You need to test things like WebSocket. You need to test asynchronous systems like message queues, Kafka, gRPC, and GraphQL is another flavor of HTTP, which, by the way, Karate does really well at testing. So if you are having a lot of GraphQL to test, Karate is really great because of the assertions and the JSON path, which is again another big area that I can deep dive into if required. And yeah, UI testing again, one of the you'll keep hearing me say, try to reduce your UI tests. UI tests have a lot of disadvantages, and I have a slide, as I said, to show you the comparison between API testing and UI test automation. So what should a test framework contain, right? I think bare minimum, as I said, assertions. I'll repeat, right? It's very easy to make an API call in any language, but the hard part is actually validating, all the data that comes back, and only then you can be confident that your business logic on this server is actually correct, right? It's accurate. And when you multiply that by performance testing, you are even more confident that it continues to be accurate even under load, right? So tagging, switching the environment, data-driven testing, of course, supporting JSON and XML. By the way, Karate does support XML. So in case any of you are, unfortunate enough to be still dealing with some legacy systems, Karate is actually a pretty good fit for testing those kind of things. Developer experience is something I care about. I'm of course a long time, mostly Java developer, but I consider myself full stack now, especially because of all the open source experience I've had, right? I never imagined that I would do things like Visual Studio Code plugin development, for example, because all that is thanks to open source and all the excitement that the Karate project has brought into my life in a sense. Debugging, parallel execution. Let me talk about that. I'm pretty sure I've seen very few tools actually being able to run all your test suites, but on separate threads. That's something Karate does really well. It's been doing it ever since the first versions of Karate. And why is this important, right? Today in this session, of course, it's not about unit testing. It's just to be clear, right? We here are talking about we're talking about the subject of end-to-end functional testing. Some people call it integration testing. I don't like all this overloaded terminology, but I call it, yeah, functional testing is probably what I would choose. So the point I'm making is that as compared to unit testing, the difference in the kinds of testing that we are talking about today, API testing, even UI automation, these tests take time. If you just look at API tests, right, each API call is in the order of a few milliseconds, right? And you never know if it's a long query, it might take even up to a second. And you all know, right, when you have many tests, and you should have many tests, because that's the only thing that's going to keep you, what do you say, sane when you have to keep releasing new versions of your software to production, and not have to worry whether everything's still working despite all the changes that you made in that version and so on, regression testing. So when you have a lot of API tests, and you should, the time taken for each test adds up really quickly. So it's very common to have your API test suites take 15 minutes, 20 minutes in some cases. And Karate is a lifesaver, because suppose if you ran all your threads sequentially and it took 20 minutes, you can actually crunch it down to 1 to 2 minutes with Karate by running on multiple threads. And there's no limit. It of course depends on the number of CPUs and RAM, the capacity of your machine and all that. But I call this out because to me, it's very surprising how very few test automation solutions out there support parallel execution. And a reminder, right? One of the criteria for a tool being considered good at parallel execution is that once you've run all your tests on multiple threads, you should get all the reports. You should get a single report, actually. It'll be just one HTML file as an aggregated report. All the threads have been combined together. And that's actually quite hard from an engineering point of view. So, which is why most tools don't do it. But Karate is one of the few tools that can actually do it. So it can save you a lot of time. Do keep that in mind. Reports is something I was talking about. And when it comes to UI, there's a whole lot of different aspects of testing. Karate does support visual validation in case you want to get into UI testing if there's interest in that. And by the way, the topic of the session, it's full stack API testing. The full stack is a reference to Karate not only being able to do HTTP testing, but even exotic protocols like gRPC, WebSockets, and Kafka, and the fact that what I call hybrid testing, right? Because Karate is one of the very few tools that combines API testing and UI automation in a single package, you can do things like hybrid testing. And this can save you a lot of time. To give you an example, if you have like a login screen taking up a lot of time when you're doing a UI test, instead of signing in by typing in the username and password in that login form, you just do an OAuth sign in. You will be able to convert that into a cookie. Anyone in your UI development team will tell you how to do that. You add that cookie into your browser, and then you can land straight onto your dashboard page. And it saves you, so much time when you have a lot of tests that you need to do on the UI. So combining API calls and UI automation calls in a single test flow or script is something you can do with Karate. And I'll give you another example. Sometimes rather than punching in all the data in this massive, data entry form on the UI, you enter all that data via API calls, and then you can test whether the UI is, working as you expect. And it's again going to save you a lot of time. It's going to be less flaky. And yeah, flaky is this big, like F word in the world of test automation. Everybody complains about flaky tests. And that's one of the reasons I say you should have more API tests, because API tests are, highly unlikely to be flaky. And trust me on this, because I've been working with API tests for a long time. You can do chaos testing and then distribute your tests if you really want to do, extra performance testing. And of course, today, yeah, we are in this world of AI and ML. Generative AI. I'm sure there'll be questions on that. So in case you're wondering, because Karate, as you saw, is a very code first solution. In other words, Karate is not a no code solution. You have to write code, but it's very simple code. And because Karate is simple code, solutions like GitHub Copilot, ChatGPT already work with Karate really well. We're getting this feedback already from our users that they are successfully using Copilot. Copilot is actually smart enough to, I believe, understand your existing patterns and your existing code. Even though you may have a very few tests, it learns quite quickly. So if you had a question in your mind, hey, what is Karate Labs going to do in the world of generative AI? We probably don't need to do anything that soon. That said, we have a lot of plans. We know there are ways to make it easier for you to write tests, maybe reduce the time to write tests, generate tests, and we really want to perfect, some of the data conversions. If you have tests already, for example, in Rest Assured, and I'm sure some of you have, we are actually working very hard on automatically converting those scripts. And by the way, if you have any other formats that you really want to migrate, do reach out. I'll be very happy to look at your current situation and figure out whether we can do it sooner or suggest an alternative to you. So this is a slide I promised for a long time, which is take the slide, go to your teams and say, you know what, stop all your UI automation and just move to API testing. It's worth it. Of course, I'm exaggerating here and I'm kind of wearing my marketing hat for Karate Labs right now. But seriously, the teams that have more API tests, for example, are able to achieve this concept called in sprint automation. I know that you've heard this term, right? Where you can actually the development in your sprint happens, and you have even the test automation in place when you close the sprint. This is near impossible. I personally have never seen in-sprint automation achieved for UI automation, but API automation just happens all the time because, yeah, API tests are super easy if you have the right tool. Okay, so last slide I have, and we can open it up for questions in a couple of minutes. This is this slide I have, for you to think about, because I think a lot of teams conveniently ignore this issue. I'm here referring to many test automation tool solutions out there that force you out of your IDE into typically a browser, into a completely different user interface where there is no version control, or even if there is version control, it's very proprietary to that tool, right? And then when you save your test data, it's typically going into somebody's cloud, and yeah, it's not in your control. And this is quite dangerous, because those of you who are experienced know that even though it might be considered test artifacts and so on, there's a good chance that your tests contain sensitive data, how to log in, maybe the URLs of your pre-production systems, which are sensitive anyways, maybe database secrets, passwords, and so on. So it's quite dangerous, to have your tests go into somebody else's cloud. Yes, in fact, one of the reasons many enterprises, especially financial institutions, use Karate, and you saw the logos I had at the early start of my presentation. One of the reasons enterprises choose Karate is because all your data is local. You don't send anything to a hosted service from Karate Labs or anything like that, and all your tests are checked into your Git repository. That's great. In fact, um, that's what I'm building here on the right side of the slide, which is, this is the ideal state. The great thing about this is your developers and QA come together. They are using the same way to write and run and maintain tests, which is the IDE, and it shouldn't be anything else, because the IDE is where you should be spending your time, whether you're a developer or a tester. You're all contributing to software development, and the IDE is your home in a sense. Some of you may have heard of the concept of developer experience or flow, and it's a known fact that suppose you shift, you do an alt tab and you go to another window, and you are going to actually suffer a drop in productivity. You'll be taken out of your flow state. So just wanted to call this out. As I said, right, one of the intents of me talking to all of you folks is to maybe spark some discussion, make you think in different ways, maybe force you to question some of the things that you may have been taking for granted or never thought about in the past. So with that, I've reached the end of my slides. We have 15 minutes for questions if you have some, and very happy to deep dive into any part of the presentation that you may be having more questions on. Go ahead. Okay, let me look at the chat. Where is the chat?
I don't think there's any questions right now.
I think, Steve, if you can check the Q&A section, there are a few over there.
Is there a Q&A section? Okay. Awesome. Yeah, I got it. So I'm actually okay to read them out and then answer them. Okay. So yeah, first question from Narendra. Can we talk a bit about consumer-driven contract testing, how Grade supports it? Perhaps a demo. Yeah, I may not be able to do a demo, but I'm going to drop a link in the chat. So give me a moment to get it out. And this is quite interesting. Yeah. So first up, let me show you the web page that I brought up. I'll send you the URL in a minute. I have contract testing is, I think, honestly, this is very, it's a very overloaded term. I genuinely feel there's a lot of confusion, and each vendor has a very different meaning when they talk about contract testing. So I'll send you this URL in a couple of minutes, but I talk about contract testing is something I feel is very hard for teams to do if you do it properly. And there is a connection between contract testing and mocks. And by the way, Karate supports both. And I talk about the difference between having a hard-coded mock, which is what I call a low fidelity mock, versus the real service, and then you should be somewhere in between. Okay, and finally, it's a long article, which is why I'm going to leave you this as like a reading material, and happy to take questions on LinkedIn if you want, or in a follow-up meeting. When you have proper contract testing in place, you will have this mock. D2 here, what I'm pointing at is a mock. So that mock is able to replace your production system, the actual system, for all the use cases that you are caring about, right? For all the use cases. And the problem with contract testing is that contract testing, at least the way that many vendors define it, is they say, and I disagree with this interpretation of contract testing. They say that contract testing is all about just checking your payload format or the schema. And I think that's actually wrong. There are two reasons for that, because validating the schema is actually a very simple thing. And since a lot of teams today use, what do you say, contracts to drive source code generation, you know what I mean, right? There's a term where you can actually write a YAML file or a JSON file and a JSON schema, and then all your payloads are generated. So the chances that your system is going to go wrong on schema is absolutely nil. Okay, and where are the problems when you connect between two systems? Like when C, your consumer, is calling your P, which is the provider. The problems are in error or non-happy paths, right? Name is missing or name already exists. And the red parts in the picture that you're looking at are because these use cases depend on state, right? They depend on the database. They're checking whether record already exists, or the ID is not found when you're trying to retrieve something, right? And you should be able to test for these cases also as part of a contract test, is what I believe. And hopefully I've given you a sense of where we are slightly different. So what I'll do right now is um, you know uh, paste into the chat the URL, so that all of you can actually have a look at that article. And I will give you a follow-up. There is a Karate example for contract testing, which you can actually try it out as well. So I'll paste that as well. So yeah, I've sent you 2 links. Sorry, I don't have time to do a demo. I wasn't really fully prepared for that, but contract testing is short answer. I believe contract testing should be exactly feeling like a normal functional test, but the only difference is you have a mock in the picture as well. And that's what keeps you going. Okay. Awesome. So yeah, that's a meaty question. So next by Karthik, do you think all kinds of UI tests can be replaced with karate tests? Yes, in fact, since you asked, let me show you a quick, I think I can do a quick demo. And I'm actually going to do a slightly, okay, this is going to be, this is a UI test in karate. So it's actually, again, simple to read. It's going to go to GitHub, log in with a user that does not exist. And you've heard me talk a lot today about assertions. So yes, we assert that the UI contains this error message after we perform that action. And then we go to Google, do a vanity search for karate. And then again, we wait for URL. We validate that we actually landed on this URL. So I'm going to run this. I'll be like hands-free right now. Chrome comes up. All that works is pretty fast. And screenshots work. We also have video recording. We have Docker containers, so you can do your testing in parallel. By the way, since Karate supports the WebDriver specification, you can run Karate tests on Sauce Labs or Lambda test or browser stack. And What I'm going to do right now as extra demo is, you see this breakpoint, right? That red dot. If I now debug this test, the test is actually going to stop at the breakpoint. So yes, Karate is one of the few tools where you can actually do things like what I'm going to do now is highlight all input fields. You see what I'm typing at the bottom left of the screen. So you can actually start playing around with your locators, figuring out what works, and you can build your test interactively. This is a REPL for those of you who know the term. And I'm going to show you something really interesting. You can actually step back in a Karate test and replay and then watch while I type different data, hot reload the test, and actually I can now move forward with the changed data taking effect. So yes, Karate has a lot to talk about when it just comes to UI automation, and I would say absolutely right. Karate can replace whatever you are thinking about, and as I said, you can actually combine UI tests with API tests. Thanks, Karthik. So next by Kishore, possible to check the database entry after the post API is run? Yes, absolutely. With a little work, you can actually hook Java code into Karate. This does require you today to be able to write some glue Java code. And I can bring up a slide for that if you just give me a minute to find it. I have lots of slides, which is sometimes yikes. On. Yes. I will share my screen again. So this is an example of calling the database as part of a Karate test. The trick here is that you should write some glue code. This is one time. So dbutils is a class, assume that I created, that is smart enough to make an RDBMS connection using JDBC. You can actually see that Karate has this very lovely interop between JSON and Java. So that config variable is actually passed as the constructor to a dbutils, which is a Java class. It all works. In fact, behind the scenes, we use a technology called GRAL. Some of you may have heard of. It's a very popular technology from Oracle that gives you polyglot programming. And one of the famous things about GRAL is that it achieves Java compilation to native code. So people are using it a lot nowadays for Lambda and AWS because you don't have that cold start problem, which Java is infamous for. So once I've I've made a connection to my database, you can now see that since I implemented a read rows method on that dbutils object instance, fire a SQL query. And one of the amazing things about Karate is that when you return from the Java side a hash map or a list of hash maps, hash map gets converted to a JSON object, and a list gets converted to a JSON array. And you can see, basically, I'll repeat what this test did, right? In just 1, 2, 3, 5 lines of code, we opened a connection to a database. We ran a SQL query. We converted the result set that came back into JSON, and then we did a match assertion on that. And this is actually part of a test. To answer your question, the few lines above this was actually an API call, and then the test was actually checking whether Scooby, whatever data was actually inserted correctly as part of the API call. So hope that answers the question. Yes, it is possible to check for a database entry. Hardik has a question called, can we migrate from another framework? It's a little hard. We are working on a way in which if you can record all your traffic into maybe an HAR file that we can automatically convert it. But if you really are interested, reach out, because we have started offering a service where we know that teams have no time to waste on tests. So it's very hard to expect you to invest sprint time or developer time to migrate. So we can actually take care of migration as a manual assisted service. We already are doing it for postman collections, and rest assured, and there's a lot of interest coming to us because insomnia has caused some waves recently with some announcements. So yes, unfortunately, Hardik, there's no easy way. It has to be manual, but we might be able to help you if you reach out, offline. And then Narendra has a question. Can we talk about? Yeah, I think I
Peter, can
covered
we
that.
go from
Yeah.
the one at the bottom? I think those are the
Oh
earliest
man, yeah.
questions.
I think, okay, I'll start with Nitin. Sorry, I was going, the reverse order. So Nitin, I think you asked the first question. Performance is measured in the background. I think you probably asked that during the demo. It's all Gatling, so we just delegate to Gatling. Karate doesn't do anything, and I think that's a good decision because Gatling is a tool that's very focused on performance testing. Narendra has a question: which scenarios does mocking add value to the test of functional tests? Yeah, it's Yeah, that's a very loaded question. And I think, you're asking maybe from the point of view of unit testing, which as I said, today's session is all about functional testing. When you do unit testing, yes, a strategy is that you mock out the database. But I'll tell you honestly, right? I think there's a school of thought now that's forming that, mocking is a waste of time in unit testing because you might as well test everything like today's session title, right? Do the full stack testing. If you have an API test, and because as I showed you, and because today we have technologies like Docker, virtualization, and all that make it very fast to write tests. I think today we are living in and you have MacBooks with M2 processors and all that. Those of you and most developers do have good enough machines, and you can also do things like code spaces and run your tests in the cloud where you really have a lot of horsepower. The point is, I think we are in a era now that even um, functional full stack tests can be fast. Okay. So I would, and a lot of teams beginning to say, let's not worry about unit tests and mocking. Let's write these API tests because they are actually exercising everything in our system, business logic and all that. You're not exercising the UI, of course, but that's a very deliberate, choice you're making. How does karate work with secrets? Dawal, short answer is typical pattern is that you set an environment variable, and then there are easy ways in which that environment variable can be picked up by GitHub Actions or Jenkins or whatever CI/CD you're using. So yes, the whole point is you should avoid checking in these secrets. I think that's your question. So yeah, by the way, Stack Overflow, amazing resource. They are like years worth of questions on karate. There's a dedicated tag, and all these questions are actually answered there. I think I've covered all the questions, haven't I? So I'm right on time.
I think Narendra had his hand raised for as a follow-up to one question.
Yeah,
Yes.
I was just
New posts.
on the point of mocking. I brought it up because you mentioned that we can parallelize the API tests as well. So I was just wondering if there's something inbuilt which gives us isolation, or is there a like how do we achieve isolation? Was the crux of the question.
I see. So if your question is that karate is good at parallel execution, both the mock server part of karate and both the API HTTP client side of karate are well engineered. They are thread safe. Um, I think it's a consequence of course, karate's code being, and we didn't get it right. There were early years of, it didn't work. There were thread problems, but I think the beauty of open source is you get a lot of feedback, you'll get a lot of contributions, you have a lot of eyes in your code. So short answer is because all the paths in karate for mocking and API request making, the client side, are thread safe. We are kind of clean from that perspective. Yeah. Okay,
Right.
I think, yeah.
I don't think we have any more questions. So thanks a lot, Peter. That was really a very insightful session. I'm pretty sure everyone gained a lot of knowledge and everyone's really excited about testing. In myself included, because this is something that we faced, I think, daily regarding how to do full stack testing. So definitely a very interesting session. To all the other audience members, our community keeps on hosting these events on a monthly basis, and we will be having another session next month as well. Do keep an eye out on our meetup page, and we should hear that from us shortly. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks a lot again, teacher, for this amazing session.